Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started as folks still trickle in. I think about this a lot, like being in a room and folks are coming back from break and needing to get their coffee and settle in for the next session. So welcome to those who have joined us. My name is Marissa Lawrence. I work as the Senior Program Officer on behalf of the CEDI program based at CANDO. So thank you very much for all of you for being here with us today. I'm coming to you today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in what is known now as Vancouver, BC. And I have the great privilege of working with a number of incredible partners on this session, which I will introduce shortly. But just a few housekeeping notes before we get started, but I'm sure you're all used to this now at this point in the day. We'll ask that you mute your mics. We would love to welcome questions, and we've left time for that at the end of the session. So please, as we're going through the session, go ahead and type your questions into the chat box, and we will get to those at the end of the session. And of course, as with the rest of the BC links, all the sessions will be recorded and the PowerPoints are made available to you on the HOVA app after links is complete. So again, just a reminder to mute your mic if you're not presenting. Thank you in advance. And with that, I would love to give a warm welcome to our partners with the South Island Prosperity Partnership. You're going to all introduce yourselves here shortly, but maybe as I say your name, give a wave. We have Christina Clark, who is the CEO of Songhees Development Corporation, but she's joining us here today as the chair of the Indigenous Prosperity Center Working Group with SIP. We have Keir Portress, Director of Indigenous Relations at Quantum Murray, also joining in his capacity as Board Director for SIP, and Alicia Glover, Manager of Strategic Partnerships, also for SIP. It's also my privilege to introduce Josh Renier, who is one of our past CEDI team members, the lead researcher and writer of this Economic Recovery and Resilience Guide that we'll speak to in just a minute here. But before I hand it over to the presenters, I just want to share a little bit about the CEDI program. So Josh, if we could just have next slide, thank you. So CEDI is a co-designed and co-delivered program by CANDO and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And I'm sure that most of you are now aware who CANDO is. Of course, we are an Indigenous-led, not-for-profit, working specifically to build capacity in First Nations in economic development, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, a large national organization that supports municipalities across Canada to lobby the federal government for program and policy change. Since 2013, CEDI has formally worked with over 15 partnerships across the country. Those include 24 First Nations and 22 municipalities. That number may seem small, but it's small because we work with each of our partnerships for up to 3 years. So we really give a hands-on support, and I'll speak to exactly how that works briefly, but we really operate with these two program objectives. And so the first is to establish sustainable and resilient relationships between elected officials, land management, economic development personnel, and of course the broader community itself. And the second is to increase the capacity to engage in and develop long-term joint community economic development initiatives and land use plans. And I often talk about these objectives as 2 feet. You can't move forward without the other. One builds the relationship and the other practices it. And so this is really, really at the basis of what we do with CEDI. Again, just briefly, I'll give an overview of the approach that we use and how that led us to build this guide on economic recovery and resilience. So we use this Stronger Together model. It's laid out as a linear process, which it's not. It's much more cyclical than this. But we work with our partners for up to 3 years to ensure that we're able to take them through each stage of this process. But I will say it's a continuum, and we will inevitably come back to connect and vision. So we really begin by supporting communities to connect, to engage in shared learning about governance models, jurisdiction, culture, you name it. This is where we would see our partnerships build a dedicated working group. Well, they would go on to meet monthly, where they would have both elected officials and staff sitting at that shared table. Vision is really where they come together and starting to really create and unite those visions to ensure that they're headed down a path with shared value. This is really where we would see a formalization of a relationship through whether it be a friendship agreement or a memorandum of understanding. In the decide stage, of course, this is where we've come together, we've identified our visions, and we're starting to develop those specific initiatives that we want to work on over the course of our partnership. And then we move into act, and I've started to call act and adapt, because this is really where COVID has taken a hit. So all of our partnerships were working on those shared initiatives that they had identified pre-pandemic. But when the pandemic hit, we started to see those gaps widen. We started to see the jurisdictional differences really become more of an issue again. And so this is really where we've come to. In April 2020, we saw that our partnerships were struggling, and in their attempt to navigate those gaps, we knew that there needed to be resources specifically for this support. And so with that, we created the Economic Recovery and Resilience Tool, a guide for First Nations and municipalities. And in the building of that tool and in the searching of other resources and other expertise or other folks trying to build resources in this way, we were really fortunate to come across the South Island Partnership Prosperity Partnership. And so with that, I hand it over to you, Josh. Give us a run through the tool and then over to our partners at CIP. Thank you very much.
Okay, everybody can hear me? My volume's okay? Marissa, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Nice, okay. So hello everybody, my name is Josh Renier. I was born and raised, and I'm currently living in Treaty 8 territory up in Dawson Creek, northern BC. And as Marissa mentioned, I'm a former formal member, but forever family member of the CEDI program. Absolutely love this work, and I was really delighted to come back last summer in the context of doing some consulting work to help put this guide together. And like Marissa said, the guide was really a response to COVID-19 as a disaster that affected every community in our country and around the world. And in particular, bringing that lens of how do First Nations and municipalities respond together as the two levels of government most closely related to their citizens. So what I'm going to do today is just quickly go through the guide. We really could do a full presentation just on the guide, but that would be awesome. But this is so much better because we get to hear from an actual on-the-ground example of partners coming together and doing this work and implementing in their communities. So I'm going to give an overview of the guide. Then we're going to hear from our real champions today at CIP, and then there's going to be a bit of time for questions at the end. And I just want to say before I move on to the kind of section of my presentation here that we're all going to be coming at this from a different place today. Everybody's going to have different roles within their community, different levels of experience responding to disasters, different levels of partnership that you might have between your community and your neighboring communities. And that's totally good. So just be asking yourself as we go through this presentation, oh, I wonder how they got there, or oh, that's something I could do in my context, because everything that comes up today is going to be relevant to some stage of that experience level. Okay. So why did we produce this guide? Well, the reality is, and COVID-19 really kind of emphasized this, but disasters around the world are becoming more frequent and more intense. And unfortunately, the projections are that that's going to continue into the future. So this, if it isn't on every level of government's radar already, it will be, because it's going to affect everybody. And what we've learned through our work at CEDI doing economic development partnerships is that there's an incredible amount of value that is brought to everybody in each community when governments, but municipalities and First Nations collaborate together, because it means nobody's falling through the cracks. But another thing we've learned through this work, and that was really evident during the pandemic, is that there are some pretty significant jurisdictional gaps that make this work difficult. It literally divides communities where they should be collaborating. And so there's a lack of resources and support and experience doing this work across jurisdictional lines. And then, as I said, COVID-19 really emphasized the need for more resources to do this work together. And I need to just acknowledge before I move on that the CEDI team, we do economic development partnerships. That's what we focus on. So none of us are at this program are experts in any way on emergency management or disaster response, but we bring that lens of partnership building and how you work together in partnership to this work. And so if you choose to look at this guide after this presentation, or if you have already, that's really the angle we're coming at it from. It's not a technical manual on how to do emergency management, but how to make sure your communities are working together effectively. And on that note, there is so much nuance across our country, so many different types of municipalities, sizes of municipalities, treaty nations and non-treaty nations, and all kinds of different diversity around our country. So no one guide could speak to all of that. So if you are picking this guide up afterwards and using it to prompt the beginning of a relationship, just remember those conversations need to happen with your partner, because every part of this country is different and everybody's local reality is different. So if you do grab the guide, like I said, why will it be useful to you? Well, here is some of the best practices that we learned from speaking to partners and experts all across the country. The first is working together on responding to emergencies increases your capacity to respond together in future emergencies. So work together on one means that the one that happens 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, you're going to have a lot more structures in place to be able to respond quickly and effectively and get your communities back in a functioning capacity. Secondly is that it ensures greater health and wellness outcomes for everybody, including the most vulnerable. So what we heard from everybody who's done this work, whether it was on floods or wildfires, is that non-coordinated responses mean that the most vulnerable people in your communities could fall through the gaps of any individual response. And so coordinating your responses is a better safety net to make sure nobody falls through that. Diverse and representative voices at the recovery table can have all kinds of long-term impacts, including the type of recovery that you pursue post-disaster. Cost savings, resource sharing, and service delivery are all more efficient and more effective when you do it together because you're not duplicating. And then finally, provincial and federal governments and other foundations and agencies are all providing funding in these moments of recovery and response. And working together means you have access to more funds. You have probably stronger chances with the ones you're applying to if you apply as partnerships, and there's a chance for pooling funds and creating a larger pie than would have been possible individually. And I just want to say that all of these best practices that we see here are going to be emphasized in SIP's presentation that's coming up. It's just such a fantastic example of this work. So I'm really excited for that. And if you do end up reading the guide after this, because you're so compelled by SIP's story that they share, the guide has 4 other case studies of partnerships across the country who have worked on some level of emergency response, whether it was to COVID, fires, floods. So if you're curious to get more details, you'll find them in the guide. I tried to distill down what this guide says into the top 4 things, because there's a lot in the guide. But really, if I had to just tell you to walk away from this part of the presentation with 4 takeaways, it's that building and maintaining respectful relationships is absolutely critical. Everyone we spoke to last summer said this work will not be successful if you don't have the relationships, and that was the most lasting and important takeaway from any kind of collaboration. Secondly is that emergency response is all about communications, both between your communities, within your community, and externally to your community. And so to make sure that you're doing that proactively and in a coordinated way is one of the best ways to reduce anxiety and any kind of harm to your citizens. The third is to choose a structure that works for you. There is no, here's what it should look like when you respond to emergency management or any kind of collaboration. Some communities respond better to formal or informal, having like actual working groups with terms of reference. Others don't want to go that route. Some people task existing staff that they already have. Others need to hire new staff. So really put some time and thought into what's going to work in your local context if you do this work. And then lastly, think long-term in your solutions. Disasters are such an immediate thing in front of you. And of course, your attention needs to be there. But as you're building back from it, it's really thinking long-term in how you want to rebuild your community and strengthen that partnership you're working on. And again, SIP is just an incredible example. The last thing I want to do before we hand it over to SIP is just situate where economic recovery sits in the broader spectrum of this work. So when we first started researching this guide, we really wanted to focus on economic recovery and resilience, because that's the work we do at CEDI, is all around economic indicators. But we quickly realized that recovery is one of 4 phases in an emergency management continuum. And truly, each of these phases is important in its own respect. Each is very awesome. If you are working on this already with a partner or by yourself in your community, that's amazing. But resilience to future disasters really comes when you are working on all 4 of these and strengthening your capacity in all of them. And so while the guide is focused on economic recovery, it really cannot be separated from these other phases of the emergency management continuum here. And this is the last time I'll say it, this presentation, but CIP is just such a fantastic example of focusing on recovery right now, but really having put in place some of the structures to work on all 4 of these different phases to really build that actual resilience in the long run. So I'm super excited to learn from you and hear from that case study in a minute. And the last thing is, I went through the guide and I wanted to pull out some best practices that you'll find in the guide that you're going to see come up in CIP's presentation. And I just wanted to foreshadow those. So at the preparedness phase, really important to build relationships and establish a shared table to do this work together. Like I said, everybody we spoke to said without the relationships and the trust there, the collaboration just isn't going to reach its full potential. And there needs to be some kind of table to do that work at, where you have decision makers, staff, and elected officials coming together. So establishing that shared table. And then once that relationship and that table are there, it's some of the really tangible things: sharing any existing emergency management plans that you have, or economic recovery plans that you have, and where there are gaps, developing them in a joint way to make sure you fill those gaps. When the disaster hits and you're responding, it's immediately connecting, convening your decision makers, and communicating about a plan, how you're going to immediately respond and communicate to your citizens. Economic assessments tend to be one of the first things that an economic development officer or department would do in this kind of moment. Collaborating on that is huge, because it means that you are getting a full picture of your entire region's economic state and can make an action plan then that responds to everybody, not just the businesses you have contacts with, but also who your neighbor has contacts with. And this is particularly important with First Nation businesses as well, who tend to get left out of those assessments. And then lastly, at the recovery stage, the ability to, as I said earlier, advocate for resources together to different levels of government, but also to re-envision what you want your economy to look like as you build back from something like COVID or a massive wildfire. And then lastly, to grow the partnership and just to continue to invest in that relationship, getting to know each other better, and just strengthening the way that you work together. So those are some best practices. There's many more listed in the guide, but these are ones that I just know are going to come up really strongly in CIP's presentation. So I wanted to foreshadow them here for you and pique your interest to go and check out this guide. I'll leave you here with the guide can be found on CANDO or FCM's websites, along with so many other resources to do First Nation municipal collaboration work. We've got toolkits, knowledge products, financial resources, case studies to read from, all kinds of things. If you're interested in doing this work or elevating the work you're already doing. Marissa's email is at the bottom here. The presentation will be available to you at the end of today. And there's our Facebook group in terms of what you need to search to become a part of our Facebook network as well. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to hand it over to CIP. They're really the champions and the experts today. I hope that gave you a high level kind of situating of where economic recovery and resilience fit in the broader spectrum of this work. Now you get to hear from the experts who are doing it on the ground, and I hope you get a chance to go look at the guide. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josh. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to Christina to introduce herself.
Thank you, Alicia. As was mentioned at the beginning, I'm the CEO of the Songhees Development Corporation, but today I'm here to represent CIP. I was the chair of the Indigenous Economy Committee, which was our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Looking forward to sharing about that. And I'm calling in from the beautiful territory of the Chianu First Nation. Thank you.
And hello, my name is Keir Portress. I'm the Director of Indigenous, of Indigenous Relations for QM Environmental. I'm Métis originally, and I'm a visitor on the land of the Lekwungen people out here, and I've been in Victoria, or what is now known as Victoria, for about 13 years now.
And my name is Alicia Glover. I use a pronoun she, her. I'm joining today from the homelands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, today known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, on whose land I am a visitor. And as a staff member of the South Island Prosperity Partnership, I also acknowledge that the South Island Prosperity Partnership works on the territories of Coast Salish and Nuu-chah-nulth peoples, specifically the Lekwungen peoples, today known as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, the Husainish nations, including Tsaout, Pocatchin, Sartlip, Tsekam, and Malahat nations, Tianu Nation and Sauk Nation, and Pachidat Nation. So over the next half hour or so, we will introduce you to the South Island Prosperity Partnership and our approach to economic development. Before I say anything else though, it's like presenting for the first time every time. So Josh, can you confirm that the right thing is being shared on the main screen? I see a thumbs up, excellent. Okay, great, thank you. So we will share how it is we build relationships and how those relationships supported the region's response to the economic impacts of COVID-19. Finally, we will share a key recommendation that arose from the region's economic task force and learnings from this process to date. So to understand the South Island Prosperity Partnership is to understand the region we serve. The South Island is one economic region with many governments, including 10 First Nations and 13 municipalities. The region had the second slowest recovery from the 2008 financial crisis, and it was recognized that a different approach was needed to avoid a race to the bottom. So a group came together to create what was initially the South Island Prosperity Project. Founded as a nonprofit in 2016, it used a collaborative model based on the Halifax Partnership with a revenue model based on a per capita funding formula, supported by different categories of membership for industry, post-secondaries, and nonprofits. Key to the creation of the South Island Prosperity Project was the intention to work with First Nations from the beginning. The organization was designed with the governance model of one member, one vote. This was key in building trust with not only smaller municipalities and First Nations, but also with industry and post-secondary partners as well. And we operate as a third party, which gives us the freedom to embrace ambiguity and an approach that recognizes that we are stronger when we work together, even if we're not quite sure how at the beginning of any collaboration. And the impact of this, this governance model and this approach is that we can focus beyond an election cycle and pursue that long game over quick fixes and work through relationships first. This creates a collaboration environment that supports innovation and provides room for members who may otherwise be constrained by more rigid systems to really tackle shared challenges. Now the South Island Prosperity Partnership, thanks to this model, our alliance has grown to over 70 public and private sector partners across the region, including 10 municipal governments, 9 First Nations, 5 chambers of commerce, 7 financial institutions, 3 post-secondary institutions, and 38 major businesses and NGOs. I would say this number is very much and counting as our membership grows, as our collaborations grow, and we find mutually beneficial ways to work with folks in the region. So like most economic development agencies, our work includes foreign direct investment and company attraction, global branding, events and thought leadership, workforce development, and cluster development. With all of our members, we provide economic development support as requested, rather than dictating what any member should do. That means we work with elected representatives and economic development staff within nations and city halls, just as we would work with industry and post-secondary members, as well as nonprofit members. Key to this approach actually working is our relationships, which Christina will now tell you more about.
Thank you, Alicia. You can advance to the next slide. So the question is, how did CIP successfully build all the relationships that allowed us to respond quickly when we had an urgent situation? So it started at the formation. As Alicia mentioned, the idea was to include First Nations right from the start, as well as all of the local governments in the region. So they engaged somebody to do that work, an Indigenous person who went to the communities and engaged with them, let them know what was happening, invited them to participate, invited the nations to put forward names to serve on the board of directors. And Songhees Nation was an early adopter and put my name forward. So I was very happy to join the board of directors of the South Island Prosperity Partnership, and very enthusiastic by what I found at that table. And that is this very inclusive approach to our economy is for all of us. And if anybody in the economy is underserved, it's hurting the whole, it hurts the collective. So all parts matter to the whole. So some of the things that were done to engage with First Nations included, we were holding something called Indigenous Connect, which was monthly meetings, and several of the people that attended those meetings are on today's call. And over the period of about 6 months, we were meeting on a fairly regular basis and bringing in speakers to talk about topics of interest to the group and trying to encourage more people to participate. And we had hoped that it would spring up in other communities. And then we hosted in 2019 an Indigenous Prosperity Gathering. And we invited folks from all 10 nations, and I think we had 9 nations represented that day. And Caroline Hilton was our guest speaker, a keynote, and really interesting presentation. This is one of the visual recordings that were done during that day. But what came out of that was all of us were saying we need to do this more often. We need to get together. We need to work together and collaborate. There are so many areas for collaboration. You move to the next slide now. So as a result of that, we have 9 First Nations as members of the partnership, and that really is excellent representation. So I think the next slide talks about what happened next. So then COVID hit, and because of all this work, we were able to mobilize really instantly. And our executive director actually was just returning from mat leave. The week she got back was when we shut down for COVID, and she really sprung into action, putting together resources on the website and starting to call in all of business leaders and community leaders to start talking to one another. And that led us to forming the Rising Economy Task Force. And what that was a group of really everybody that were members across sectors. People were invited to come together and avoid the duplication of these different groups trying to figure out what to do and lobbying government for support in their area. We wanted a more comprehensive kind of plan. How are we going to deal with this? How are we going to respond to it? How are we going to advocate for what our needs are during the early phases? And then how are we going to recover? So we formed a group of committees, and that's on the next slide. Oh, timeline. So we launched in April 2020. So immediately after COVID, that was instantaneous. So this is recognizing there were 40 leaders, there were 10 sector committees. We published the committee reports in August of 2020. I chaired the Indigenous Economy Committee. We got a list of committees coming up. And then in September and October, we had a working group review all of the recommendations and put forward those which were most likely to be able to be activated immediately. And it was called a reboot report was launched. And then we've been having regular meetings where all of the leaders come together to look at where are we at with all of the recommendations that we made, which ones are active, where do we need to put more resources to get things started. And it has served as a way of looking at very holistically at our economy and all the components of it. Now let's look at the list of committees I promised on this slide. So including that there's sector committees here on agriculture, education, ocean, real estate, retail, tech, tourism, arts and culture, and transportation. We also added an Indigenous Economy Committee and an Inclusive Economy Committee. With the Indigenous Economy Committee, we wanted to hear from the First Nations themselves as to what is their experience and what are their needs at this time. And in Inclusive Economy, we wanted to capture all folks that may not be fully participating in the economy. And that definitely included a lot of social service organizations that are members of CIP and organizations that work with newcomers and wanted to make sure that our approach to recovery didn't leave anybody out. This link at the bottom here, read reports here. You can find all of the recommendation reports produced by each of those committees. You can also find those on the website for South Island Prosperity Partnership. We can turn to the next slide. So the main findings for the Indigenous Economy Committee was what we really found is that the same things that were happening for others were happening in an Indigenous context, but even more challenging, because a lot of the issues that were making it difficult were existing before COVID came along. So COVID's been a big amplifier, and it amplified where there were gaps. And so when we met with folks from communities and heard what their immediate concerns and needs were, some of the things that came up was needing to better integrate Indigenous businesses into the regional economy, needing to access the young and growing workforce, Indigenous workforce into the economy. It's a huge asset that our region has. A need to upskill and reskill on an urgent basis. We can't afford to put people through school when we need them working right now. So we needed something to address that need for the rapidly changing world for us to keep up with that. And we really, more than anything, needed one place that could bring all of these things together, a resource, because it's scattered across the region, pockets of activity happening, but nothing comprehensive for the whole South Island. So that kept coming up. We need a place, we need a center, somewhere where we can portal even to work through to address all of these concerns. And could you turn it to the next slide? So the main thing that was the main recommendation is to incubate and spin off a regional Indigenous Economic Development Office for the South Island, and to pursue the funding to make that happen and to begin to enhance collaboration among the nations. And the lead for this in the short term would be South Island Prosperity Partnership, and in the long term, First Nations led. And so we're looking for funding support, and we've gotten some from Western Economic Diversification Canada, Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. CIP has provided funding, and we're also working with the Capital Regional District as a support. And so we're hoping to get this up and running in the short term. We're looking to hire a coordinator right now. Next slide. So with as we started talking with the nations about what this could be, we started to change the way that we referenced it, because in the South Island Indigenous Economic Development Center kind of suggests it speaks for the nations, and it's not fair to say that it does or will. It will speak to those nations that choose to participate with it, and we don't want to duplicate what other nations are doing. So we're calling it an Indigenous Prosperity Center, and it will really be those nations or Indigenous businesses that choose to work with the center. That's who it will represent, but it certainly will be a conduit to be able to get information out through our networks. And what we hope to do with the Prosperity Center is to enhance cooperation and communication, coordinate efforts, especially when we're going for a procurement on bids. Sometimes we need to more than one company come together and do a joint bid. Upskilling and leadership training, as I mentioned, and identifying and pursuing procurement opportunities. And centralized employment agency would really be helpful also. So that's what we hope to do. And I'm going to turn it over now to Kier to speak to the next slide. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. And a lot of the work that we've done to date, just like Alicia and Christina's story, have alluded to, is we bring a lot of the communities into this. So the First Nation communities, as well as the Friendship Center and the Métis Nation of Greater Victoria have been involved in sort of the first steps of incubating the center. And phase one funding is being identified as we speak, and we're trying to find those different ways to be able to get this going, because it's a lot of work and a lot of collaboration, and we think it's a really great way to go. And IPC is still seeking partnerships with the governments at different levels, whether it's the federal government, provincial government, or municipalities. as well as industry. We see a lot of collaboration and a lot of partnerships growing out of this. And that's sort of the main part that we're trying to do here is, just like Christina said, is we're not looking to lead it, we're looking to approach it together. Next slide. And so a big part too is, how do we begin this work? And, what are the key things that we have from these learnings? And so a big part of it is, having pre-existing relationships is super, super important in the way that we communicate, and the way that we're able to move quickly and effectively, because those pre-existing or existing structures and of communication and collaboration really helped the task force be quick and effective. We were able to build independent committees from different sectors and really brought them together through that diversity and amplified engagement because of that. And it really tied those efforts into each other and made it, just that much more robust. And it made it clear how interconnected everyone was, right? It's not just one industry, struggling or another industry. It's how all those industries and businesses and people really interact. And that's why this work continues to be really important, and the impact from, whatever the negative impacts of whatever's happening in the world right now, really showed how those interconnectedness was affecting things. Next slide. And a lot of the lessons, so, we continue building relationships is a huge part of that. It's, relationships don't just end when things start happening. So, always continue building relationships. Ensure staff are working together. So whether, they're in different organizations or different governments, just make sure everyone's, on the same page when stuff isn't happening. And then when stuff does happen, that way everyone's able to work together in a streamlined way, right? So really look at the way that those systems are happening now, so that when you really need them, it's easier to get those resources when you need it. The other thing is, it can be tough to fund collaboration, just like Josh was saying, right? Jurisdictional gaps, how do you deal with all those? And I would say in the past, a lot of Indigenous communities and municipalities, wanted to work together or were looking for ways to work together. And I think going forward, we're seeing a lot more overlap and a lot more collaboration to fill that gap. And as for next steps, we're really looking to incubate and spin off the Indigenous Prosperity Center, again, not as the leader of economic development with and for First Nations, but just there as a support for anyone who wants to be part of that. So if, people have certain things that they bring to the table and are able to support their communities, great. Maybe they just need a little help, but other organizations might need a lot more help. So just being there to help that. Continue engaging the region to monitor and support recovery. So don't just say, oh, we're out of it now, but really work together to look at that going forward. SIP and the Indigenous Prosperity Center, we want to continue being a third party. Just like Alicia said, sometimes being a third party makes it a little bit more flexible or a little bit more nimble to take on things, and just keep learning. Don't assume that we know everything. And I invite everyone here to really just do it. If you haven't had a good relationship with the local municipality, or you've been meaning to reach out to somebody, just do it. I think a big part of developing those relationships is really taking that first step. So really look at developing systems that will improve or sustain that collaboration going forward, because again, we're seeing a lot of that overlap. And so really focus on building relationships between staffers, right? If both organizations have emergency response people, great. get them to know each other, get them to have each other's cell phones and stuff like that. It's not just, oh yeah, I know somebody's there, when I need him, I'll call them. It's like, no, grab coffee, go out for lunch, and trust that strength comes from collaboration and relationships. As individuals or as individual organizations, often we can be strong. But again, when you're looking at a region, that interconnectedness really translates into strength. That's what we found at CIP and, continue to find, I think, going forward. Look for our guide and read it. Even if there's a lot of information in there, and just see what we found and take the lessons out of that might be helpful to you, and reach out to us or Can Do if you want to have a deeper conversation on that. I think a big part of this too, especially with the Indigenous Prosperity Center, we're really seeing industry, move towards a lot of the same stuff here. And I think as municipalities and communities, we have a really good opportunity to really build on that and help support the way that work is done and the way that, response is done in these ways too. So I think that the next one might be the last slide. Yeah, so thank you for listening to us and taking the time to be part of this, because obviously everyone's interested, and we're interested in just sharing our perspectives and our work that we're doing under CIP, and even individually, but how we can help move this forward. So I guess, do we want to open up for discussion or anything like that?
That's great, Kira. Thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to add them as we go through. I know Josh and I always are bursting with questions for you folks. So we have one or two to sort of fill the gap if there isn't any. But maybe I'll give it just a minute. If anybody has anything to ask, feel free to ask in the chat, please. Right, well, I'll kick off with ours first. So this isn't rehearsed, so if there isn't an answer to this question, that's okay. But just out of curiosity, I now follow CIP and all of the developments that CIP has quite closely, and I saw that a strategic plan was recently released. And I'd be curious to know, since all of this work has taken place over the past months, almost 12 months, I guess now, I'd be curious to know how, if at all, was ICP engaged in the process of that strategic planning, and were there any lessons learned from all of the process of working on economic recovery and resilience focused projects and then building out a strategic plan that maybe is more robust or resilient in nature? So I don't know if anybody could speak to that.
Happy to. So IPC engaged. So IPC is still an idea, and a beloved idea at this stage. But I think in the strategic plan, if you were to have a look, especially the operating plan, it reflects the respect for how much time, more time is needed to continue engagement in the development of the initial business plan. So. In terms, just to speak to that specifically, but many of the values and the pillars in the plan directly reflect what was identified by the community through the task force process, and specifically in the reboot report, and many of the key recommendations that were still in progress, that are still underway, that the South Island Prosperity Partnership is incubating, are in that operating plan, which is also quite candidly why I still have a job, because I actually joined CIP to support the task force, and a number of the priority projects that emerged from our committees and through the reboot report. So. Yes, Christina or Kira, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. There's, it came out of the work from all this, and so after all the analyses and everyone came together, it was like, this seems like what we need to do, and then we really focused on that as a committee and as a board to try to move this forward, because again, like I said, like industry is moving towards, you know, a really collaborative model towards doing projects kind of everywhere, and that's what I've seen working with Quantum Murray and where I was before Quantum Murray, and so having a center where communities can find support, or that can help lobby different levels of government in ways that maybe a single community or single organization can't, I think makes it really, you know, makes it more effective for everyone in the region, not just one person, or not just, you know, the one sort of community that is really able to do well in that space. I think it kind of helps everyone.
I could speak to Roy's question about emergency response centers. So hi, Roy. So Roy asked, do you have a Nation Emergency Response Center EOC, or what about a multi-municipality EOC? So I can speak to that for Songhees Nation. We don't, but the way I think here on the South Island with all of these municipal governments, most of the First Nations, we have an emergency agreement with a neighboring fire department. So for Songhees, it's View Royal Fire. So that kind of includes us in their catchment area for emergency planning and the nature to which they're integrated with others. I do know that there was recognition, I think province-wide, there was recognition that there should be regional emergency planning with First Nations included, because when you've got feds looking at one part and the province looking at all these gaps, jurisdictional gaps again, and it just as we're learning in the economic development front, when the funding is coming from two different pots and they're not talking to each other, it makes it really difficult for us to collaborate across these borders. So all the more reason for more conversations. And here in the South Island, that's an ongoing conversation about how do we integrate our multiple fire departments and police departments and ambulance services to create more efficient and better services across the region. And I think that also makes sense in the First Nations context, that we should all be coordinating regionally. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, if I can just also say to your question, Roy, this was a big thing that came up in the research I did last summer, speaking to people across the country, and some stories like in Alberta where the chief was not invited to come to the EOC, and he literally went and kind of burst in and said, my community is getting burned down too, like I deserve to be here. And that shook up the whole provincial EOC thing in Northern Alberta. And then probably one of the more kind of exciting and good examples I've seen is out of the Newhulk Nation. They've recently, in partnership with the regional district in that same area, signed a memorandum of understanding with the Emergency Management British Columbia. So the three of them together signed an MOU so that all emergency management response activities in their region go through one centralized, coordinated group that involves people from the nation and the regional district. And that what that does is that bridges that federal provincial jurisdictional gap that is the issue in most of these cases. And the example was so effective for their region that ISC is going around basically province to province now, starting to draft up these provincial federal agreements to have their emergency management things led at the provincial level but funded federally, so that this jurisdictional gap is no longer there. So you've just hit the nail on the head in terms of one of the big issues for emergency management responses, and it's something that's in process of being addressed, but is certainly a massive gap that remains almost everywhere in Canada.
Yeah, the other side, if you don't mind me sticking my nose in either, but the other side of that is with a lot of the wildfires that happen. So I did some research as well, and the knowledge that a lot of the First Nations communities actually brought to the table in those emergency situations were just as good or better in those emergency situations. So I think that's also why that jurisdictional gap is closing, because the people on the ground are actually asking for it, right? It's not, some bureaucrat being like, oh, we don't have to put money into it. It's like, in these emergency situations, people are like, we can't not do this anymore. Any other questions out there?
Got one from Roy again. What about emergency preparedness working groups, including the RCMP, BC Ambulance, BC Wildfire, MODI, CNR, and CPR, etc.?
I personally can't speak to that. I'm not I'm actually very new in my role at Quantum Murray. Maybe ask me in, a year or a few months, I can maybe answer that a little better, because we do have a emergency response and management, teams, and do it across Canada. But I'd invite some of the other people here maybe to talk to that.
I can briefly just share from a perspective of a current CEDI partnership based in Northern Alberta. That partnership has experienced really terrible wildfires in 2019, and then of course the pandemic over the last 15 months. And so they've decided to create what they're calling is a joint regional emergency plan. But the process of co-creating that is one that is full of many phases and requires a lot of engagement from both communities. The municipality is situated close to one of the 3 nations communities that are actually geographically quite spread out. And so the reality is that they always have this vision of it being regional. And I do think engaging a number of the parties that you mentioned there, Roy, but their intention is to first co-design that, sort of the parameters of what that needs to look like for their 4 communities first and foremost. And then they're starting to engage other levels of government, Alberta Emergency Management Association and so forth. But they've really decided to stay small and really ensure that they are on the same vision for their communities, which I think has been a really smart first step. And it's allowed their communities to really be the drivers of what this emergency preparedness is going to look like. They're featured, that's a partnership featured in the toolkit in our guide. So if you'd like to read more about them.
And I don't, similar to Kier, I did not see or learn of any examples, Roy, of partnerships and any formality with, truthfully, any of those groups, let alone all of them. So I think you've identified a real area for some innovation and growth there. Yeah.
Again, I think it's about that connectedness, right? Is getting people on the phone and starting those relationships now. So it's not, oh, stuff's happening, we now need to phone the RCMP. It's like, no, we have this really deep relationship, and I can phone, Constable Bob, and because he's the person to call in this situation. And I know that often jurisdictionally or personally, that some of these relationships can be really tough, depending on areas and histories. But I would encourage, to get your staff, or, if it has to start at the executive level, then you can start building those relationships and bridging those relationships if they need to be bridged before you can start getting there. But yeah, just like my one slide, just do it. Just get out there,
And if I can just highlight SIP, I mean, I think there's so few examples across the country of partnerships of that many partners across so many different areas, where you've got municipalities, First Nations, also private sector, educational institutions. I mean, that it really is something unique. And I mean, Roy, your question is speaking to a very diverse set of partners in a way. So I think some of the magic that has been demonstrated in what you have all done through SIP is probably what needs to be tapped into for something like that.
Yeah, well, I think a big part of that too is, economic development. I'm sure there's a lot of economic development people on this call that, it drives networking, right? A huge part of what I've been doing, you know, for the last 5, really 10 years is building my network and, you know, staying in touch with people and understanding how some people can work with other people, right? I don't know how many people that I've connected with over the years and actually just passed them work. I'm like, hey, you know what, this person can do that. Using that same approach, except now in, you know, sort of that community or municipal, I think is not necessarily new to somebody who is sort of works in economic development, but it's that jurisdictional piece, you know, knocking down those barriers. So when you do make those calls or when you do reach out, it's not, no, that's my area, go away. It's like, oh, that's a really cool thing. Actually, let's try to work towards that. And I'm sure that's something that Christina, you know, I know she's working on lots of different files, but coming with that economic development perspective of just networking and just trying to find the best thing to do for, you know, for everyone, because that's what networks are about.
And to build on that too, I think a key practice that I've observed while working with the South Island Prosperity Partnership is this, also an understanding that just like different sectors are experiencing the economic impacts of COVID-19 differently and on different timelines, you know, so are nations and so are municipalities, and so there's kind of this yes and approach. You know, yes, there were dates, you know, along the task force process, but there's also an understanding that, you know, join as you have capacity and your input will be as welcome as any other person at the table. And that's also, you know, reflected in the different timeline for many of the different recovery projects that were put forward and that have been carried forward into our strategic plan. You know, continuing, you know, engagement and you know, this co-design and co-development of the IPC is the key next step for, you know, for this particular project, out of recognition that nations have been managing, you know, multiple crises and the health aspect of this crisis, you know, for the last year, which and you know, it's so this is, you know, a mechanism where we can remain in communication and in collaboration with First Nations, you know, while, you know, supporting continuous momentum for the initial ideas and projects that were identified earlier on in the process. So it's a very different timeline than another project that I'm working on with, like the Ocean Cluster, which is, it's just different. So I think a respect for everything, you know, I think Marissa said it really wisely, act and adapt. So, you know, it's adapting, you know, to make sure that all who want to be involved are involved and have, you know, the space they need and the time they need to be involved. So thanks.
Well, I think that's it for us, Paul.
Yeah, if there's no more questions, then we'll say thank you to everyone for joining us and for presenting and for being part of BC Links to Learning. And we look forward to touching base with all of you again, and a couple of sessions that are still yet to come today and a whole bunch for tomorrow. So please take time to continue your learning and sharing. So thank you very much. And oh, is there a, oh, okay. Thanks, Roy. We had fun too. So take care. Appreciate all the, you taking the time and for sharing it with us. Take care. Bye-bye.